back to Z-Speed, part 2 BC coilover install. This time we're doing the rears. But before we get started, I wanted to go over the reasoning behind not lowering the coilover by 2 fingers before I installed it and just leaving it at stock ride height. And it's because of this end link right here. It's a non-adjustable end link. You can see it's kind of flexed right there as it is. And if you lower the BC coilover or make it a little bit shorter than the stock shock, when you go to bolt it in, you're going to have to push up on the lower control arm to get it to bolt up or to line up. And I just thought I'd make it easier on myself by keeping it to the original ride height and then lowering everything after everything's bolted up and everything is torqued to spec. So that's the reason I didn't explain it on the last video, why I just went ahead and returned it to original ride height. So now we're going to get ready to install the rears. Okay, before we get started, I just want to show you how easy it is to remove these 2 panels back here. That'll give us access to the area that we're going to be running our dampening extension knobs through. And it's just 2 clips that hold this little panel on. And if you take your time, they pop off pretty easily. So that's the good news. It's easy to get this little panel off. And if we look down here, there's a couple of different holes that people use. Some people widen one hole, some people don't. I'm going to show you how to use one of the holes to kind of bend the extender over and tuck it underneath the cover so we don't have to actually damage it whatsoever. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and get this car on jack stands and get ready to install these coilovers. Okay, let's go through the bolts that we're going to be removing. First, we're going to remove this bucket bolt, this bolt that holds the bucket on to the spring. We're going to also be removing this bolt that holds this camber arm right here, both sides, and this is going to be replaced right here with a lockout washer. And we're going to have to remove this little plastic guard right here so that we can gain access to this rear sway bar that's going to have to be removed or just shifted a little bit so we can get these bolts out of this camber arm right here. So we will be doing that first before we get to the spring removal and the rear shock removal. So we'll go ahead and remove those first. We'll remove this dust cover first, or this little panel, with 3 10mm bolts. And just be careful when you release it, because I found a lot of rocks and small debris in this panel and it kind of went everywhere. So be careful not to get anything in your eyes. And I just went ahead and put the nuts back on the bolt so I didn't lose those. Okay, with those panels out of the way, now we have clear access to the rear sway bar bolts. There's 2 on each side, and there's just a little bracket that holds on a rubber bushing, and those came off pretty easily. There's a bracket on each side of the car, so remove those next. Okay, now we're going to break loose the rear camber arm, and we're going to start with the one attached to the knuckle, rear knuckle. And let me tell you, you're going to have a nice extension on this breaker bar here, because this was by far one of the toughest bolts to break. And make sure you go around and you PB blast all these bolts prior to breaking them loose, because I had to really torque this one hard to get it to break loose. it was on there. And you can see I used an extension on my breaker bar just to get enough leverage to pop this guy loose. So I thought I would just tap the bolt out with this rubber mallet and it would pop right out. And of course, that rarely happens the way you want it to. So I had to whip out the jack and apply a little up force because it was stuck in there. And make sure you're using plenty of PB Blaster on everything because that might definitely help you out. There's probably some oxidation going on in here too. I've got this little handle here that I like to use because it's actually used to attach sockets, and it has a flat blunt end on it right there. It's a little square, and it really handy little tool to knock bolts out of tight areas. So use whatever you have available, but I finally got to pop out, as you can see right there, and now we're ready to take the other bolt off. Okay, before we can remove that bolt, we do need to finish taking these brackets off. If you haven't already completely removed those, go ahead and disconnect those brackets. And I actually did disconnect this end link here. You may or may not have to, because all you have to really do is just move the sway bar around a little bit to get the bolt by. Also, if you have a Tomei or aftermarket exhaust, you're probably going to want to put a napkin or a rag or something up here to keep this from getting scratched up. Okay, you can see we have the brackets released now, and I've got a little protection for my Tomei. I got some napkins jammed up there, and the sway bar is just kind of relaxing or resting on top of the Tomei exhaust. And now I can manipulate this rear sway bar enough out of the way to slide these bolts out of the camber arm. And I've already taken the nut off here. I didn't show that, but I've released that. And now I can pop that bolt out and just clear that sway bar and get it out of there. I'm going to show you the other side. Sorry about the lighting, it's a little dark over here, but you can see that the brackets have been released. All I have to do is take that nut off, and then I can slide that bolt out and just get enough clearance to pop it out here and get this camber arm out of here. So we're going to do the same thing we did earlier. We're just going to tap these bolts out, and it came out pretty easily. Didn't have to use any up force, so that was the good news because we already take the tension off the other side. So it came out relatively easy here. So now we're ready to go ahead and release the spring bucket, and you do not want to be anywhere underneath the spring bucket when you take the bolt out. So all I'm doing here now is I've got an opening wrench on one side and a breaker bar on the other, and I'm just breaking the nut loose so I can get the nut off. And then we're going to apply some up force on this whole spring bucket because there's a lot of tension on that bucket from the spring, so you probably couldn't get the bolt out even if you wanted to without some up force here. So once you think you've got that pretty close to neutral, you can go ahead at this point and grab your breaker bar and ratchet that bolt the rest of the way out, keeping the tension on the spring bucket. Okay, once you get that bolt out, now you're ready to release your jack and get it out of the way. Be careful and don't put your hand down there directly underneath the bucket or anywhere in the path of destruction here, because once you tap this, it's gonna boom, pop loose, and right there is serious impact, and actually got hung up on the cardboard a little bit. Shot debris everywhere. That spring had a lot more tension than I thought it would, and you would definitely get hurt if you were in the path of that. So stay clear and be extremely cautious when releasing this. As you can see, you can get hurt. Once you get that out, you're also ready to go ahead and pull out these two rubber stoppers, one on either end of the spring, and that just is no longer needed because we're removing that whole spring from the bucket at this point. Okay, I thought at this point it would be really easy to just push this back up, tap it in there, and it should line up perfectly, and throw the bolt in, put the nut on, we're good to go and move forward. But that's not the case, because this was actually one of the hardest bolts to line up out of all of them, and you really have to loosen the bolt on the other end of the spring bucket to get it to line up properly. And I really had to work at it up, down, sideways, and just take your time, because it's not just a quick bing bing with a boom. You have to actually work at it to get this to line up. It's actually not only a spring bucket, but it's a toe bar too, so it adjusts your toe. So it's got a lot of adjustment there. That's why it wasn't so easy to line up. But once you finally do get it lined up, then you can go ahead and bolt those two down. Now we're ready to go ahead and move on to the actual lower part of the shock, and you can see it's just one bolt, and it's got actual threaded end in there, so it's just a bolt only, no nut. And you've got these two, I think they're 12 millimeter, but don't quote me on that, and those come out real easy. And you can see I've already hit them with some PB Blaster just in case. So now we're going to start with the bottom bolt, and we're just going to have to, once again, it's been in there for 15 years, so even with the PB Blaster, we're going to have to use some leverage with my breaker bar. I like my little 3-foot extension there, or 2.5-foot extension. That really helps break things loose. And once you break that loose, it should come out pretty easily. Okay, once again, even though I broke the bolt loose, I still need a little up force to take the stress off of the bolt so I can remove it. And once I do that, it comes out really easily. Now I'm just checking the threads to make sure they're in decent shape. It's been 15 years, and I'm going to add a little grease once they've checked out to lube them up. And now we're on to the two upper nuts up here, and we're going to go ahead and break those loose. And those were not a big problem at all. Like I said, the PB Blaster did a great job, and they came right out. Okay, once you have everything all freed up, you can jiggle it around, make sure it's broken loose. And at this point, I decided to just grab a rubber mallet and tap the bottom of the shock loose, and that seemed to work pretty well. It popped out pretty easily there. So now we've got the old shock out, and we can compare the new BC coilover with the original equipment. And as you can see, there's a fixed nut on the old one, and with the new BC coilover, there is a nut that's zip tied to the actual coilover itself right there. So we're going to use that in place of this fixed nut, and that would be only difference between the two. So just make sure the logo's facing out. So this will be the driver's side, and this right here will be the passenger side. now we've got a couple options here. We have this hole right here, which is actually where the push pin goes through, but it's directly above the shock. So if you take the dampening extension, it will literally just stick straight up through, and you could cut a hole through the little plastic panel, and it'll be sticking straight up, and it'll be easy to turn. Or you have this slanted side, and you'll run it through this way. Of course, this is backwards, but I'm just using this to show you what it'll look like. And it's going to be basically still turnable, but it will have an angle to it, and it will chafe a little bit. So those are the two options you have. And after a little bit of consideration, I decided to go with the angled version this way. And my hopes are to actually take this, and I'm actually going to tuck it, and I can go ahead and tell you it worked out great after it's all said and done. This piece was actually long enough with this little cap on top to actually slide just a little bit underneath that aluminum flap you see to the left. That little piece of aluminum, that brushed aluminum, the decorative part, the actual handle that I just put on will actually just slip right underneath that, and it was perfect. So once I was able to get that slipped underneath that plastic that brushed aluminum, boom, I just popped that little panel back on. You never even know those two dampeners were underneath there. That's the way I'm going to go. I'm not going to make any holes anywhere or enlarge anything. I'm going to try this. Worst case scenario, it may damage the plastic sheath around here, but I can always get a new one and modify it later if I need to. But I'm going to at least try this and see if this works long term. Okay, I've attached the dampener extension to the top of the shock, and you can see right here this little red dried up looking gasket. I salvaged that from the original shock because the BC coilover didn't come with this little gasket, and it was in there between the wheel well and the shock. So I wanted to reuse that to keep it as close to original specs as possible. You may or may not want to use that depending on the condition of it. And now all I'm going to do is line everything up and get ready to bolt everything down. And I went ahead and slid the dampener through the little hole that I decided to use, and we're going to line it up, and I'm going to use a jack to push up on the control arm so I can have a little tension before I bolt up. Okay, all I have to do now is tap in this bolt, and we're going to torque it down the nut to 53 foot-pounds. And I'm going to be putting all of the torque specs in the bottom of the description, so you can go through and find all the torque specs. But we're going to torque that to 53, and after that we're going to go ahead and bolt down the two nuts up top, and those are 21 foot-pounds. So I'm going to get my torque wrench in there. I have to use a long extension so I can get this torque wrench in there. It's kind of a big one, so it's hard to maneuver it around, but we're going to torque those down now. So I walked out to take a break, and I looked up, and there was a super blood wolf moon. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but it was pretty amazing. And I think the next lunar eclipse is July 16th, somewhere around there. But if you get a chance, check it out. It was really interesting looking. I had watched it earlier when it was white, and then now it's turned blood red, and it was really neat. So I hope you enjoyed that. Sorry it was shaking around a little bit there. But now we're going to have to get back to work. Okay, now we need to do some adjustments to the Spl Camber Arm before we actually get it into the car. And the directions are really well done, and we're going to be going over the rod end adjustment in a little more detail in a minute. But you'll be doing most of your camber adjustment right here, and you'll be using these nuts to lock it in place once you get that adjusted. But at this point, what we really want to do is make sure that the entire length of the camber arm is as close as possible to the original equipment. So we have to get them lined up, and then we're going to insert a bolt on both ends just to make sure that we got, or as close as we can, to the exact same length. And we're going to be using these lockout bolts in place of the old camber bolts, because we'll be using the entire camber arm to adjust the camber from now on, so we won't need those camber bolts. But basically we just need this whole thing as long as the original one, so we don't tear tires up on the way to the alignment shop. And once you get those lined up, you should be able to insert a bolt through either end, and that should be close enough. Okay, let's take a look at the rod end itself, and there's some examples of what you do and do not want once you install it to the subframe. And this actually happened to me. It tilted like this once I got it into the subframe, and I've got a little trick for you. I used a screwdriver to straighten it out, and it came out just like that, and it was not too hard at all. So make sure that when we go to put it into the subframe, we don't end up with something like this, because that is misaligned. And as far as the rod end itself, we have to make sure that when we thread it together, that we've got equal spacing on both sides. You can see the max and minimum is in the directions, but that amber part of the bolt is where you're adjusting the alignment. So if you got it cranked in too far on one end or the other, you're not going to be able to do an appropriate alignment, because you're not going to be able to spin that bolt correctly. So pay close attention to these directions and make sure we get this as close as possible. Okay, I found it a lot easier to go ahead and insert a bolt through the knuckle and into the camber arm right here before we attach the rod head to the subframe. It was just easier to line up this way. I tried it both ways, and this was a lot easier because I ran into the problem that they showed in the directions earlier, where the rod end misaligned or got tilted. And these are just the washers we're going to be locking out, and the collar will lock out when we're all done. But right here you can see I've got a screwdriver put through the rod end, and I'm able to just move it around just by torquing the screwdriver back and forth. I can straighten this whole rod end up and get it as perfect as, or as close to perfect as possible with the screwdriver. Then pull the screwdriver out while supporting the rod end, and then slide my bolt in. So this is how I did it, and like I said earlier, it got misaligned, but I was able to straighten it out like this. So try that. And once you get the bolt in, then you can take this little collar right here and tighten that down with an Allen wrench, and then we can go ahead and tighten down the blue nut. Okay, I just wanted to show you the lockout washer placement. It fits right in this groove, and just pay close attention to it when you're bolting the camber arm into the subframe. Make sure that these things do not slide or misalign. I had a problem with misalignment on the back side, and I had to actually take it off and realign it. So just be very careful with those lockout washers. Make sure that they're nice and lined up in the grooves as you tighten down the camber arm into the subframe. Quick note about the original shocks, they were completely shot. I compressed the rear and it would not even re-expand. So you definitely need to change the shocks out every 50-60,000 miles. I was basically riding on springs, and these new coilovers, once we get them adjusted correctly, should be an incredible improvement over the original. Now we're going to look at the dampener extensions, and I chose the second hole like we talked about earlier. It does chafe a little, and it's a little bit harder to actually spin the dampener knob, but not that much. And so once we put the little knob on the end, I'm going to show you how we tuck it underneath the brushed aluminum piece. And it slides under there just enough of the end of the knob will keep it in place and hidden and tucked away, so we can actually pop the plastic piece on top, and you'll never really know that this knob or this extension is under there. So this worked out pretty well for me. You can go ahead and drill a hole through this plastic piece if you want and have the extensions stick out into the cabin. Okay, now that we've got everything installed and torqued to spec, we can go ahead and start our preliminary adjustments to get our ride height correct. After I lowered it, I thought it was going to be a little too high like the front, but actually it was pretty close. I was about 2 fingers versus 3 fingers when we started, so I was kind of happy about that. And the next day I pulled it out and took a better look, and I noticed that my front was really too low. I ended up just really cranking it almost all the way down just to see where it would end up, and the tire's actually starting to tuck there. You can see that. And I actually took a little test drive just right down the end of the driveway and into the street, and the Spl Camber Arm actually slapped the frame a little bit, so it was way too low. So I'll definitely need at least a 2-finger gap in the front and in the rear to keep my ride height street worthy. If I go any lower, I'm probably going to end up damaging the Tommy exhaust, and that's the last thing I want. And if in the future, if I go with larger rims, I should get a lot better fitment as far as tire tuck and all that. So I'm checking the exhaust right now, and I'm really about as low as I'm going to be able to go and still get over speed bumps and get up on a little ramp for my alignment. So you have to think about being able to function on the street on a daily basis and all the obstacles you may run into. So we don't want to go too crazy and get too low at this point. So I'm going to show you what I was talking about earlier when I clapped the frame with my SPC arm right there. It was clapping right there because I had it way too low. Didn't cause any damage, just got a little scuff mark on it, and I wiped that off. But that's what happens when you go way too low. You're going to have problems with that. So at this point, we're going to adjust the shock and bring it up a little bit. And really, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is loosen this collar right here that holds the brake line and the speed sensor line. Make sure that's nice and loose so you can basically just spin the shock body and raise or lower it. Of course, we're going to raise it up this time, and then you loosen the very bottom collar, loosen that up so that you can either go up or down. You're not going to really adjust anything with these 2 upper collars. All you're going to do is spin it, the top collar with your spanner wrench. And I even found out that it's way easier just to grab the whole shock with your hand, and you can spin the whole thing freely. You don't even need a spanner wrench to, and it's kind of clunky trying to get in there and spin the whole thing with the spanner wrench. It's easier just to grab the shock body itself, and you spin it clockwise to lower it and counterclockwise to bring the ride height up. So it was much easier, or you can use a spanner wrench like I'm doing here, but it's quicker to just grab the whole shock body and spin it by hand. Now you want to get both sides even, so I use this little digital caliper to measure both sides and get them extremely close. You can use a ruler if you don't have one of these, but this came in real handy to get both sides even. So that really was a big help right there. So now it's time to go get an alignment and see if we can get it dialed in. Now I like to go to Firestone because for about 175, 180 bucks, you can get a lifetime alignment, and after 2 alignments, it pretty much pays for itself. So that might save you some money. Check into that if you have one in your area. So once the technician got up to the ramp, he got a little concerned that we wouldn't be able to get clearance, and I was a little afraid myself that we wouldn't be able to clear. So he had me run up front and watch the front lip, and thankfully we just squeaked by with a few centimeters clearance, and we got the front up the ramp. And he said, well, you better go run and check the exhaust because we definitely don't want to scrape that up. And so once I got down and looked at it, I noticed we had just enough again to get up the ramp, and so we just barely cleared everything. So the 2-finger gap was about as low as you can go with these 17-inch rims, and I was very thankful that we were able to clear the ramp and get it up for an alignment. And here are the results. Before we had anything done, the camber was awesome already because we dialed that in super positive, if you remember, all the way as positive as we could. And we got a -8, -6, which is great. The caster is out, but we had no idea where our caster was going to be. And that is adjustable with our new SPC arms. Toe was way out. The rear, everything was out except the camber on the right side was just barely in. So that's to be expected since we adjusted everything or changed everything. And then after our alignment, look at the front. Beautiful camber, -7 on both sides. Caster is way out on the right still, but we can adjust that with our SPC arms and get that right back in spec. We'll be doing a video on that, and the toe is spot on, but we put brand new toe arms in, so we would definitely be hoping for a perfect toe on the front. Now on the rear, we had a problem with our camber, and he told me it was because of the toe arms. We have those old spring buckets on. They're barely adjustable at all for toe, so he had to leave a negative camber in there because we just didn't have any toe adjustment. So we're going to need new toe arms, adjustable toe arms, and that'll be next. And the negative camber on the rear will actually give us some grip, but I want to make that camber, I would like to get it in spec, so that's the plan, is some new toe arms, and we'll be showing that soon. I hope this video helped you out. If it did, please like and subscribe, and Z-Speed will be back soon with another one. Until then, you know what to do. Just keep on repairing.